Arr, and good morning to you. Do you talk like a pirate, eh? No. But, as it so happens, it is the day in our Hero Tales series when we move forward to Roosevelt's story of a battle in the War of 1812, centering around an American privateer. Now, a privateering ship is a privately owned ship, and a ship which has the authority of a government behind it, the license, more or less, of a government to capture enemy shipping. And for the early American Republic, blessed with fine shipyards, a lot of ships, and a great many skilled sailors, but not with a large navy composed of traditional warships, privateering could be a very, very effective strategy. And if you want to learn more about that, as it so happens, tomorrow's Homeschool Friday session at 10 o'clock in the morning is on privateers in the American Revolution and forward in Charleston. But today we're going to look specifically at the career of one ship. That ship is the General Armstrong, named after a Revolutionary War general, and fighting in the War of 1812. And I say fighting. It's not really a privateer's job to fight. You know, the movies always feature, the pirates are out looking for a battle. Pirates don't look for a battle, and neither do privateers. They look for easy captures of valuable ships. And that's their strategic role, too. Not only is that what the captain and crew were thinking, because they didn't go out there to get hurt, they went out there to get rich. But it's also the national strategy, the idea of sending privateers out against an enemy, especially an enemy like Great Britain, who has so many rich trade routes, and the empire's prosperity depends on its shipping. To harass and capture those ships is something that is very inconvenient and annoying to the enemy, and might very well encourage them to sue for peace a little bit sooner. So, we're going to talk today about the General Armstrong, whose Captain Samuel Reed not only didn't talk like a pirate, but he didn't think like a privateer. And that turned out to be all to the good for the legend of the General Armstrong, for she would become a ship noted for not taking a lot of prizes, as a privateer was meant to, but instead for a desperate and very effective fight that did a lot for the American reputation. Now, as usual, Roosevelt and Lodge kick off the story with a bit of poetry. For once, I'm going to dodge their poetry and grab another piece. I think the reason they used a few lines from Tennyson instead of the famous poem, The Fight of the General Armstrong, was that at the time the book was written, it was probably cliche to use this poem about the General Armstrong. It was so familiar to us. It's not anymore. So let me use it to set the scene. Tell the story to your sons of the gallant days of yore, when the brig of 7 guns fought the fleet of 70, from the set of sun till morn. Through the long September night, 90 men against 2,000, and the 90 won the fight in the harbor of Fayal, the Azores. The General Armstrong was a brig. She hailed from New York, with a crew of 90 men armed with one heavy 32-pound cannon. And again, that refers to the size of the cannon ball that was thrown, was 32 pounds, and 6 lighter guns, being an example of, as Roosevelt writes, by the end of the War of 1812, American privateers had won for themselves a formidable position. They were usually armed with one heavy gun, the Long Tom, as it was called, arranged on a pivot forward or amidships, and a few lighter pieces of cannon. They carried strong crews of well-armed men, and their commanders were veteran seamen used to brave every danger from the elements or from man. So boldly did they prey on the British commerce that they infested even the Irish Sea and the British Channel, and increased many times the rate of insurance on vessels passing over those waters. And the most important strategic aspect sometimes of privateering was the most boring sounding. It were insurance, lads. If you drove up the insurance rates on shipping for the British, powerful, rich British merchants began to complain in Parliament, and that tended to shorten the war. Well, the commander of our ship today, the 7-gun brig, the General Armstrong, is Captain Sam Reed. Captain Sam Reed is from Norwich, Connecticut, and he has served as an officer in the Navy. Of course, he's not an officer in the Navy at the time that he commands this privateer. He's commanding the privateer as an ordinary citizen. He's operating on his own, not at naval orders, not receiving pay from the United States government or anything like that. But he's a Navy veteran. And in fact, not only has he served in the United States Navy, on the warship Constellation, by the way, but his father had been an officer in the Royal Navy, the British Navy. And his father had resigned from the British Navy, chosen the Patriot side in the American Revolution, but apparently raised the young man to a sense of honor and discipline, and perhaps taught him naval tactics young. Whether or not he taught him somewhere, Sam Reed certainly learned. And in command of the privateer, the General Armstrong, thought I had a better picture of her. Hold on. In command of the privateer, the General Armstrong, and you can sort of see her to the side there, he's not going to think like a privateer. He's going to think like a naval officer, like a man whose commitment is to winning a battle against his country's enemies, not like somebody whose main job is to slip away and find another easy capture. And the action of our story today takes place in the middle of the Atlantic. You see there the Azores, and Faial is a Portuguese property. These islands belong to the Portuguese. And Portugal was neutral in the war that was going on between the United States and Britain. And here. So right here, the Azores, is where our action's going to take place today. The Portuguese are neutral, and the General Armstrong has pulled into the harbor there. Now, the harbor of Faial, and you can Google it up if you wish, it is surrounded on 3 sides by land. It's a very secure harbor. It's also a very hard harbor to get out of if anybody is trying to stop you. And the General Armstrong cruises into this harbor to stop there, and as the poem puts it, The noble Portuguese to the stranger, have no fear. They are neutral waters these, and your ship is sacred here. But the privateersman said, well, we know the Englishmen, and their faith is written red in the Dartmoor slaughter pen. Come what fortune God may send, we will fight them to the end, and the mercy of the sharks may spare us then. Well, that's a very romantic depiction of the situation, but it's pretty accurate too. It's a neutral harbor. No acts of war are to be carried out within it. The General Armstrong has anchored, but so has a British fleet. And it bothers them very much that one of these American privateers, which are such thorns in the British side, is anchored there in the harbor and protected, supposedly, by the laws of neutrality. They're supposed to leave this ship in a neutral harbor alone. But Portugal isn't a particularly strong European power, and the Royal Navy is the strongest in the world and used to getting its way. In December 1814, she was laying in Fayal, a neutral port, with 4 British war vessels, a ship of the line, a frigate, and 2 brigs. The port was neutral. Reed knew well that the British would pay no respect to neutrality laws if they thought, at the cost of their violation, they could destroy the privateer. He immediately made every preparation to resist an attack. Now, these attacks are not going to come about by big warships going against one another, even though the ship of the line is far more powerful than the little privateer is. Nevertheless, oh, hold on, my circle stuck around with me here. 1 second. Rotate. There we go. But the attempt to capture the ship is going to be made not by big warships and thundering cannons. In fact, the British probably hope they won't especially be noticed by the neutral authorities in the port as they send boats full of men to sneak over and try to what they called cut out or board and capture this American privateer. On their side, the British made ready to carry the privateer by boarding. The shoals, that is the shallow places and so forth, sandbars and such, rendered it impossible for the heavy ships to approach. The lack of wind and the baffling currents also interfered with the movements of the sloops of war. Accordingly, recourse was had to a cutting out party. That's what they called these, a cutting out party. Always a favorite device with the British seamen of that age, accustomed to carry French frigates by boarding and to capture in their boats the heavy privateers and armed merchantmen, as well as the lighter war vessels of France and Spain. The British first attempted to get possession of the brig by surprise, sending out but 4 boats. These worked down near to the brig under pretense of sounding. In other words, pretending to be taking the depths of the harbor. Of course, when you've got boats full of armed men, that probably wasn't very convincing. They were doing exactly what they looked like, which was, quote, trying to get close enough to make a rush and board her. The privateersmen were on their guard and warned the boats off. And after the warning had been repeated once or twice, unheeded, they fired into them, killing and wounding several men. The boats returned to their ship. This first check greatly irritated the British captain. They decided to repeat the experiment that night with a force that would render resistance vain. After it became dark, 12 boats were sent from the liner and the frigate, manned by 400 stalwart British seamen, and commanded by the captain of one of the brigs. Through the night they rowed, straight toward the little privateer, lying dark and motionless in the gloom. As before, the privateersmen were ready for their foes. When they came within range, opened fire on them, first with the long tom, and then with the lighter cannon. But the British rode on with steady strokes, for they were seamen, accustomed to victory over European foes. Danger held no terrors for them. With fierce hurrahs, they dashed through the shot-riven smoke and grappled the brig. And the boarders rose, cutlass in hand, ready to spring over the bulwarks. A terrible struggle followed. The British hacked at the boarding nets and strove to force their way through to the decks of the privateer. The Americans stabbed the assailants with their long pikes and slashed at them with their cutlasses. The darkness was lit by flashes of flame from the musket and cannon, and the air was rent by the oaths and shouts of the combatants, the heavy trampling on the decks, the groans of the wounded, the din of weapon meeting weapon, and all the savage tumult of a hand-to-hand fight. At the bow, the British burst through the boarding netting and forced their way to the deck, killing or wounding all three of the lieutenants of the privateer. But when this had happened, the boats had elsewhere been beaten back, and Reed, rallying his grim sea dogs, led them forward with a rush, and the boarding party were all killed or tumbled into the sea. Half the attacking force had been killed or wounded, while of the Americans, but 9 had fallen. Now, this defense, ferocious and effective as it was, still left the privateer outnumbered and trapped more or less in the harbor with an enraged British fleet around them. And so Captain Reed made a difficult choice for a naval officer, but the right one in the situation, because as the next day, the British began to drag, using small boats, their big warships closer into position, clearly intent on again attacking the Armstrong, and this time not even worrying about subtlety. And Reed made the decision to abandon the ship and sink her there so that she wouldn't become a British prize. And first he carried his cannons on shore and was depending on the Portuguese government to respect the neutrality as far as once they were on shore, they would certainly be safe. And again, this wonderful old poem, The Fight of the Armstrong Privateer. And the dauntless captain said, "Take our wounded and our dead, bear them tenderly to land. The Armstrong's days are o'er. But no foe shall tread her deck, and no flag above it wave. To the ship that saved our honor we will give a shipman's grave." So they did as he commanded. And they bore their mates to land with the figurehead of Armstrong and the good sword in his hand. Then they turned the long town downward, and they pierced her oaken side, and they cheered her, and they blessed her, and they sunk her in the tide. Tell the story to your sons when the haughty stranger boasts of his mighty ships and guns, and the muster of his hosts, how the word of God was witnessed in the gallant days of yore, when 20 fled from one ere the rising of the sun, in the harbor of Fayal, the Azores. Captain Reed is remembered for another reason. If you'll look at the flag on the left side of this screen, he is the one who designed that particular variation of the American flag. It's one that's sort of in the middle. Remember, originally our stars were in a circle. Today they are arranged in lines. But briefly, in the middle, the stars made a star in this national flag designed by Captain Reed. But his big change that he made, at first we decided whenever we added a state to the United States, we would add a star and a stripe. And that was getting silly because the flag was getting long. So it was Captain Reed who designed the flag that said for the first time, okay, stars for every state, but stripes only for the original 13 colonies. And so that aspect to the American flag today, we still owe to Captain Sam read. Now, whenever we've gone over one of these hero tales, we have always taken a second to think about why it was included, what message Roosevelt and Lodge were trying to send to Americans in the future with any particular hero tale. And with the fight to the General Armstrong privateer, we have a couple of themes repeated that have been done before. One of them is simply the theme of defiant courage, that these American sailors are second to none, not even the vaunted British Empire, whom they certainly see as a worthy foe, but that Americans can hold their own with anybody. Again, we have ships, American ships being used to put American power across the world. The harbor of Fayal the Azores. We are more than halfway across the Atlantic at that point. The Azores are actually considered, I think, the furthest western part of European territory. And we see the concern with American honor. That there's not a lot of special strategic reasons here to hold a desperate fight when a privateer could just as easily have abandoned the ship the first day and said, well, let the British superior forces capture our ship if they insist on it. We'll all go ashore and lodge a diplomatic protest, and maybe some big brother will come to our aid and rescue us. This is not what American honor demanded, and that's not what Captain Sam Reed and the Armstrong carried out. So a tremendous, adventurous sea story, and I commend to you looking up the poem, The Fight of the General Armstrong, as well, if you get interested here. If you'd like to come visit us tomorrow for Homeschool Friday, we'll learn about privateers operating from Charleston, South Carolina. And next Tuesday and Thursday at 9 o'clock in the morning, we will continue with our American Hero Tales. Do I have any questions today? Well, thank you all for coming in and spending your time with history this morning, and I look forward to sort of seeing you next time. And we will be closing in 3, 2, 1 later on.